Hello, I'm Leia, and this is Ian and Courtney. Today we are going to talk about the specific biomechanics of kicking a soccer ball and the injuries that could be associated with such a movement. There are a couple different ways to kick a ball. The one that we will be talking about today is the instep, or strike. To begin, we have broken down the movement of kicking into 5 phases for both kinds of kicks. The instep kick is a powerful shot that is used for striking a long ball or shooting. The 5 phases of this kick are preparation, backswing, leg cocking, acceleration, and follow-through. The preparation phase begins when the kicking foot is at heel strike position and ends when the same foot is at toe off position. In this phase, we can observe hip extension and plantar flexion. Hip extension uses the gluteus maximus, biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. Plantar flexion uses the gastrocnemius and soleus. The backswing phase begins when the kicking foot is at toe off position and ends when the hip is at full extension. The leg will be entirely behind the rest of the body in this position. The movements observed are hip extension and a slight knee flexion. In order to extend the hip, the gluteus maximus, biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus must contract. The leg cocking phase begins with max hip extension and keeps the hip extended while also flexing the knee. During this phase, the hip will still be fully extended, but will now also have a slight lateral or external rotation. We will also observe that the knee becomes flexed. The muscles used to flex the knee include the biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. The lateral rotator group is used to rotate the hip. This group consists of 6 muscles, including the piriformis, gemellus superior, obturator internus, gemellus inferior, obturator externus, and the quadratus femoris. The purpose of this phase is to create more distance between the foot and the ball so that maximum acceleration can be achieved. Again, this is a powerful kick, so applying more force will allow the individual to kick the ball harder and faster. The acceleration phase is from knee flexion to ball impact. As the name suggests, the leg is accelerating in this phase. The force of the foot on the ball is directly related to this phase. The movements in this phase include hip flexion and a slight internal rotation, knee extension, and plantar flexion. Plantar flexion also occurs in the first phase. As the leg moves backward, however, the foot relaxes slightly. Then, during the acceleration phase, plantar flexion is very prominent. The muscles used for plantar flexion are the gastrocnemius and soleus. The rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and vastus intermedius are used to flex the hip, and the iliopsoas, rectus femoris, and tensor fasciae latae muscles are involved in internal rotation of the hip. The final phase, the follow-through, begins at ball impact and ends at toe speed inflection. Though this phase ends before the kicking foot hits the ground again, the entire movement can be done a couple different ways, depending on how the individual was taught and the situation they are put into. Some individuals will remain on their supporting leg and swing their kicking leg up with a slight internal rotation as it comes back down to the ground. This technique may be used to avoid a collision with another player. A second option is to have the supporting leg lift off the ground, and then while the individual is in the air, the hips rotate to allow the kicking leg to fall to the ground first. But there is no forward motion, and the kicking leg ends up landing very close to where the supporting leg took off. This allows the ball to reach a higher apex, but will not give it as much distance. This option is also often observed as a tactic to avoiding a collision. The final option is when the supporting leg lifts off the ground and the kicking leg keeps on its path until it hits the ground again, propelling the body forward. This technique is used most by players and is strongly encouraged by coaches, even from an early age, as it allows for the most force production. Here we have Courtney performing the third option, in which her kicking leg will continue on its path and propel the body forward. The movements in this phase include ankle dorsiflexion and hip internal rotation and flexion. The muscles used for dorsiflexion are the tibialis anterior and the extensor digitorum longus.
There are 3 classes of levers, each of which can be found within the human body. Each part of the lever can be easily identified. The bone is the lever arm. The muscle is the applied force, the joint is the axis of rotation, more commonly referred to as the fulcrum, and the resistance or load is whatever weight the muscle is moving, whether that be a barbell, dumbbell, body weight, soccer ball, or anything else. An excellent example of the first-class lever in the body is the tricep extension. A second-class lever is demonstrated well with ankle plantar flexion in the calf raise. And a third-class lever can be seen in a bicep curl or the extension of the knee joint in a kick. Not surprisingly, the third-class lever is the most prevalent in the human body. However, under controlled eccentric movement of the weight, a third-class lever actually becomes a second-class lever. This is best seen in the lowering of the weight in a bicep curl, where the weight becomes the force and the muscle is acting as the resistance. The second-class lever provides the highest mechanical advantage because the moment arm of the applied force is always longer than the moment arm of the resistance. Mechanically speaking, the most advantageous angle to hold a weight at, in the bicep curl for example, is 90 degrees. This is because the applied force moment arm is longest in that position. The moment arm increases with flexion from when the elbow joint is at full extension until it reaches 90 degrees. It then decreases as the joint continues to flex. We see levers at work in every major joint during a soccer kick. The ankle becomes a second-class lever during plantar flexion in both the planting and kicking foot. A third-class lever can be seen in the flexion of the hip and extension of the knee. Angles and angular motion also have large roles in a soccer kick. Angular units work the same as linear units, just in degrees instead of meters. Angular distance, therefore, is the total distance in degrees that an object travels about an axis. Angular displacement is the difference in initial to final angular positions of the moving body. Angular units are also measured in radians. 1 revolution equals 2 pi radians, or more simply put, 1 radian equals 57.3 degrees. So 1 full revolution, 360 degrees, equals 6.28 radians.
In projectile motion, gravity causes a projectile to move in a parabolic path that is symmetric with the apex as the highest point in the trajectory. Air resistance affects the horizontal velocity of a projectile, thus making soccer a difficult game. 3 factors that influence projectile trajectory, the first being projection angle, the second, projection speed, and the third, relative height of projection. In the absence of air resistance, the trajectory of a projectile assumes one of 3 general shapes, depending on the angle of the projection. The first shape being perfectly vertical. This projectile follows the same path straight up and then straight down again. The second is parabolic. This is an oblique projection angle between 0 and 90 degrees. The trajectory is shaped like a parabola. It's symmetrical, and the right and left halves are mirror images. Perfectly horizontal is on an angle of 0 degrees. The trajectory resembles 1/2 of a parabola. Projection speed of a ball will determine the height and range, which will be where the ball will end up. In soccer, the relative projection height is 0, which means the angle is 45 degrees. To achieve maximum horizontal displacement in soccer, it will mostly depend on increasing the speed of the projection. Keeping in mind the rotation of the ball wouldn't have much of an effect because the ball is sphere, unlike a football. Compression is defined as a pressing or squeezing force directed to a surface. In the spine, L5 to S1 is most likely to be herniated. Tension and compression stress are both sometimes referred to as axial stress because the forces act along a structure's longitudinal axis. When the spine flexes, the vertebrae discs undergo compression stress on the anterior side and tension on the posterior side. In soccer, compression of the spine causes injuries at about 10 to 20 years earlier than the normal population. A big part of soccer is using your head in defending, scoring, and passing the ball, so it's common to have chronic changes in the spine. When a force acts on an object, there are 2 potential effects. The first is acceleration, the second is deformation, or change in shape. This ties in with Newton's first law. A ball will stay in motion in a straight line unless acted on by external forces. This can either be a kick or a pullback with a soccer ball in any direction. There are 3 main forces acting on a soccer ball, including weight, drag, and lift. The first one, weight, is thought of as Newton's law of gravitation. In Major League Soccer, a soccer ball is equal to 1 pound. This weight in a single point is referred to the center of gravity. When the ball is flattened in the air, the center of gravity is directly in the center, and the ball is rotating around this single point. The second force is drag force. This is referred to as air resistance. The conditions in a soccer game play a big part with air resistance, thus changing the difficulty of the game. The surface of the ball plays a part with velocity and the resistance as well, as a ball has stitches and is not smooth all the way around. During the World Cup in 2010, grooves were added to the surface of the ball to try to make the surface of the ball more uniform. The last factor is the lift of a soccer ball. This depends on how an individual kicks a soccer ball and the conditions of the wind. There are different types of spin that can be put on the ball while in the air. For example, a vertical axis would conclude the lift force to be horizontal and can be resulted into a curved soccer kick called bending the ball. By changing the axis of rotation to horizontal, making the lift force vertical, the ball can then be lofted into an area usually used for a cross in a soccer game.
Two very common injuries associated with kicking a ball are to the hip flexor and to the groin. Injury occurs from overuse, abuse, improper or lack of stretching or warming up before kicking, and not enough rest or recovery time. When the muscles are stretched too forcefully or too suddenly, this can also cause a tear or strain in the muscle. The best way to prevent this would be to stretch and warm up the specific muscles before doing any activity that involves kicking. Thank you for listening to this presentation of the biomechanical workings of a soccer kick. We hope this video will help you better understand the specifics of everything that goes into kicking a ball. Thank you.